Hello, everybody, and welcome. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, or whoever's here, just interrupt me at any point. I'm more than happy to go down various rabbit holes to make sure people understand. Next problem, let's go for that. So hopefully what we're looking at is controlling permissions to Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance using Excel and Azure DevOps. If not, go to one of the other fantastic sessions. So my name is Rob Sewell. I work as a consultant for myself. I used to be a production DBA, but nowadays I just help people to automate things. I'm a dual MVP, so I'm an MVP in cloud and data center management and data platform. The best way to get in touch with me is absolutely on Twitter. So SQL DBA with beard. So please feel free, if you have any questions, any point in time, throw them over to me and I'll get back to you when I can. And that's also got my blog address and the link to our book. So what's the problem? Yeah, 2020, that was a problem. And we're still in 2020 and probably will be till the end of the year. But this presentation came from a request from a client. Please, can you automate a solution to make it easy for the ops team to control the permissions to Azure SQL Database and the Azure SQL Managed Instance estate? And we'd really like to use Excel because, of course, users love to use Excel. So, okay, let's step back a bit. Let's look at how we create Azure SQL Database users. So we need to have our Azure subscription account, and then that's going to be connected to an Azure Active Directory domain, either managed or federated. And then admin accounts can be created either as SQL authenticated accounts, so SA, don't use SA. In fact, I don't think you can use SA, or an Azure Active Directory admin for your SQL server. And those are account or groups that you set up when you create the Azure SQL instance. You can set that setting. Those users will have permissions to create accounts. So depending on the type of admin account that you're using, you can then choose, you are then able to make different types of users and logins. So for SQL Server admin, you can create a user based on SQL Server authenticated logins or contained database users. So users that are created within the database but don't actually have a login to the instance. But that's all via SQL Server Administrator, SQL Authenticated Logon, so usernames and passwords. So we don't want to do that. Azure Active Directory admins can create users based on SQL Server logins, so SQL Server logins. We can create contained database users. They're also SQL Authenticated logins. Or we can create contained database users from Azure AD users and groups. That sounds like just what we need. What we need to be able to do is create users or groups from Azure Active Directory as contained database users for access to our resources. So realistically, we've just got one option in what we can use. We can only use an Azure Active Directory authenticated account that's an Azure Active Directory SQL instance admin, easy for me to say, and we would then be able to create contained users. So creating an Azure Active Directory contained database user. We're going to have infrastructure as code for our deployment, our Terraform, the Azure DevOps pipeline that I showed just before this started. We'll go back and have a look at that in a moment. And that enables us to programmatically create our Azure data resources. And what we want to have is an automated permissions as code pipeline without any manual intervention. So how do we create an Azure Active Directory contained database user? We can use T-SQL. It's a very simple piece of code, create user, the name at the domain.com, and we add this thing from external provider. That tells SQL that we're going to use an Azure Active Directory account here. But only connections established with Active Directory accounts can create other Active Directory users. And this is where my fun started and where the idea for this session came. Because up until this point, it's pretty simple. We'll get a list of users, we'll run that T-SQL, they're created, done. However, what we ended up needing was a list of things to do like this. So we need to apply permissions using SPN. We need an Azure SQL Server identity. We need to set our Active Directory admin. We need a directory readers role. This was the most problematical thing that I had to do. We need an Azure DevOps pipeline, and we need to put our permissions in an Excel sheet. So let's take a look and see how those things work. So we have to be able to log in as the SPN to run our T-SQL code. And we're going to use dbatools to do that. It would be great if dbatools could actually create the contained database user, but with the ever-changing way Azure AD and Azure in general, it's never actually been set up. So what we do is we use connect DBA instance. So there's our connect DBA instance. Let's have that one. There we go. So we have a connect DBA instance, and then this is called splatting. So we set our parameter variables up at the top, a SQL instance, a database name. We have a credential for our connection. That's going to be our app ID and app secret for our SPN. We need to add in our tenant ID for Azure AD, and we need to add the flag trust server certificate true. And then we connect to our instance and we set that connection into a variable called Azure SQL. Now, this is something that I recommend that you do every time you work with dbatools, because then you have one connection that you can reuse. Once we've done that, we are going to use invoke DBA query to run our T-SQL. Our SQL instance is not the name of our instance, but it is our connect DBA instance variable here, Azure SQL. We'll pick our database name, and we can put our query in, and then we run our query with invoke DBA query. And when we finished, we use connection context.disconnect to remove our connection. That's what it looks like. That's the query that we're using. You see, it's just some T-SQL. I've added in some additional validation. So we make sure that we check whether we've got our user or not. And then we make sure we check if it's a member of the role that we're adding to. And then we format into that query our principal and the role that we've chosen. And then we run it with invoke DBA query. We add messages to output. So the output of our T-SQL, you can see we've got our print creating, our print the user exists, or we're adding the user. That will then come out in the output of our PowerShell command, and therefore in our Azure DevOps logs. So that's how we can apply permissions to an SPN. So great, we can just go straight forward and run that code. If only it was that simple. What we need next is we need for the Azure SQL instance or the Azure SQL Server to have an identity. Now, we can do that straight to PowerShell using the new AZ SQL Server command, and then we have an assign identity flag here. What the assign identity does is it creates an object within Azure Active Directory. So if you don't use that, you just have an Azure SQL instance. If you do use that, then you have an Azure SQL instance, and inside your Azure Active Directory, you have an object that you can then apply permissions to. In exactly the same way as you have a virtual machine or a machine object, a computer object in an on-prem Active Directory. I like to use Terraform. So when I create an Azure SQL Server with Terraform, I use this resource. And then I need to just make sure that I add this identity blob in. And it has a type of system assigned. That's the only type that there is available. And once we put that in our Terraform, we've created our Azure SQL Server identity. The next step that we have to do is we have to set that SPN that's running our Azure DevOps, that's connecting to be Active Directory admin. So when we make our T-SQL connection, that user needs to be an Active Directory admin. Remember, creating an AAD contained database user can only be done with an account that is authenticated against Active Directory. So we have to make sure that that account also has the permissions to do it. We can set the Active Directory admin in the portal. If we go to our SQL instance, we've got a Active Directory admin. We can add in a user there and hit save, which is not there, it's over here. Hit save, and that will create our Active Directory admin. We can do it within PowerShell with the set AZ SQL Server Active Directory Administrator command. And we need the display name, but we also need our object ID here. Or I like to do it in Terraform. So in Terraform, in my Azure RM MS SQL Server resource, I've got an Azure AD _ administrator, and then I can put in the username, so that's my display name, and the object ID of that user or group. So that's our Active Directory admin sorted. So now our T-SQL connection can be authenticated with the SPN using dbatools, and it has the permissions to be able to connect to our instance and add permissions. Bingo, everything's done. On-prem, that would be it. We would have given the account the permissions to be able to create users and apply permissions, and then we could connect and everything would be golden. Not in Azure AD. In Azure AD, what we need is to give the instance and the SPN the directory readers role. And the directory readers role is an assignment that allows that object to be able to read from the Azure Active Directory. It's automatically applied to users, just like it is on-prem, but for SQL instances and for other resources, it's not automatically applied. Also not for our SPNs. So we have to add that in. Now we can go to the portal, we can go to Azure Active Directory, we can find the directory readers role, and then we can add the assignment to both the SQL instance and our SPN. Whilst that works absolutely fine for myself, because in this demo, I've got complete control over my Azure Active Directory. I am the global master, god of all, wizard of everything. So I can do all of the things. In a corporate environment, that's not going to be shown. And to be able to add this these users or these SPNs and identities to this role, the script must be executed by an Azure AD global administrator or a privileged roles administrator. As you can tell by the names of those roles, these are not the things that most corporate environments are happy to give to just some bearded DBA consultant. So this is where we face some challenge. Now, the way around, or one way around this, is in the public preview, and I think actually, I don't know, it was in public preview when I took this screenshot. You can actually assign this directory readers role to a group. So then only once do you need to have somebody with global admin or privileged roles admin permissions to be able to grant this role. You can create a group. Maybe it's Azure SQL instances the bearded fella creates, and then give the bearded fella permission to add users or identities into this. And then all you would need to do is add the SQL Server identity from Azure AD into that group, and you wouldn't need all of these permissions. I was unable to persuade the Azure AD administrators that this was the way that things should be done. They wanted auditability, and they wanted process created for every single SQL instance that was created. Unfortunately for them, that meant that I had to do a lot of paperwork, and they had to do a lot of work, but that was the process that was required. It also then slows up your capability to move forward. So if you can get it done with a group and the role permissions added, then that would be a better way forward. So having battled through all of that, then I've got my permissions able to be applied with an SPN connecting via dbatools. The SPN is an Active Directory admin, and the SPN and the Azure SQL instance are members of the directory or have the directory's reader role assigned to them. Now all we need is an Azure DevOps pipeline. So we have an Azure DevOps pipeline over here, and it's got some steps. At the top, what we've got is our trigger. So I would like this pipeline to run whenever the branch includes main and when the path includes permissions. So I keep my Excel sheet in the permissions directory, and then whenever that changes and it gets pushed up, then we will trigger a build. We have some variables that we set. So we've got our key vault. So I would always recommend that you ensure that you keep all of your secrets within a key vault and then programmatically go and gather them. This is actually the thing that broke my demos this morning, because I was using an old version of the az.keyvaults module, and the Azure DevOps hosted agent had decided between the last time I ran this demo a couple of weeks ago and today to update that module version. So that was some of my fun this morning. We add in our SQL Server resource group name and the name of our SQL instance. The next problem that we have is that we need to be able to connect our hosted agent to our Azure SQL instance. And then whenever you've worked with this, you know that you have to control the network permissions. If you're connecting publicly, you need to add your IP to the firewall rule. And if you're doing it internally, then you may be using endpoints and NSGs to control this. This hosted agent is sat outside of any of your infrastructure. And whilst you can add the IP addresses of the hosted agents into the NSG or the firewall on your Azure SQL instance, there are many of them and they change. And in fact, you don't always get the IP that Microsoft says when you run a hosted agent. In my experience, about 4 times out of 5, you will get an IP from the range they say. And the other time, you'll get one from somewhere near, because Microsoft thinks it's more important that you get an agent to run than you get an agent with the right IP. So adding all of those into the firewall rule and keeping them updated is tricky. So I worked with the corporate team and I said, look, there's another way of doing this. What we can do is we can go and get the IP address of our particular hosted agent, and then we can add it to the Azure Key Vault and to the SQL Server instance firewall just with a bit of AZCLI. We do it to both the Key Vault to get the secrets and then to our SQL Server instance. And you'll see we've got an enabled true here. That enables us to just control each task. Next thing we do is deploy the permissions from the Excel workbook. Basically just run a PowerShell script. So we'll have a look at that in a while. Now, we can add these permissions to the firewall, add the IPs in, but we want to make sure that we remove them. And if our pipeline breaks for some reason or one of the tasks fails, we don't want to leave the firewall with that IP already having permissions. So we use this condition parameter on our task, and we set it to always. And that means that no matter what happens to any previous task, this task will always run. And now by that way, we remove the firewall rule from SQL and we remove the firewall rule from our Azure Key Vault. So now we've got a pipeline that can run the PowerShell that can connect via an SPN to run T-SQL. It can use the SPN's permissions, which are Active Directory admin. The SQL Server has an identity. The SQL Server and the SPN have directory readers roles. All we need now is an Excel sheet. Excel sheet looks like this. So, yeah, that's a bit naughty. I've got my taskbar sat over the top, which I apologise for. So we have a workbook with 3 tabs. We can add in our instances here, our databases, our roles, and the description of our roles. This is because we had many custom roles for this client. This front sheet then controls the next sheets. We can add in our instance, our principal, what users are we going to use, and whether they're going to be an admin or not. So being an admin in Azure SQL instance means that we give them the login manager or the DB manager role, which means that they are able to create databases and to control logins. Before anybody notices and they say, yes, here I am demonstrating with users. Absolutely correct. When I am doing this in a production environment, I am doing this with groups. But it was funnier for me to make up a load of names that you might recognize as users than it was to create a random load of groups just to add. Once we've added our users, we then make sure that we put them into the database, whatever principal and whichever role. So we need a line for each role membership. There we go. We have all of the things. Now, when we make a change to our Excel sheet, we can just push that change up. Azure DevOps will kick off and it will apply all of the permissions. And it looks a bit like this. In fact, it looks exactly like this. It will give you the output from the T-SQL, tells you that the user exists or that we're adding a user into the database. Not only that, if you have a user in a database that's not in your Excel sheet, it will remove the user. It will also, if a user has the wrong role memberships, it will remove them from the role as well. So the Excel sheet becomes the truth about what our instances are. as you can see, we remove the user from our role there. So everything is there. We've got everything that we need. An Excel file which we can have permissions. Now the Excel file we gave to the users, to a non-technical group, the group that interfaces between IT and the business, because they were the ones that were always passing on the please can this user have access to the DBAs. And they were also the ones that kept on asking can you audit the permissions on this instance or this instance or for this group to the DBA. So we took that pain away and enabled them to have control. We did also put in just a validation so that the DBAs could check who had been being given permissions. But ultimately, it was down to the business to decide who had access to the resources, not down to the DBAs. We would guide the users in what they required when apps were built, but other than that, it was down to the business to say, this group of people need access to this data. We were not in control of that decision. We just applied what was said. So there's my contact sheet. If you would like to get in touch with me, please feel free to. What we're going to do now is see what happens. Normally, I'd be totally confident that everything will work beautifully, but today it has not gone like that. So unless there are any questions.
It's just one of those days, you mean?
It certainly is. So if anybody has any questions, feel free, shout up. I can't see any in the chat, but
I have some questions that I would like you to talk about. I think we have a few minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
How comfortable are you in general with this approach of managing permissions in an Excel sheet? Because if a customer would come up to me with a task like that, I'd try to talk them out of it.
Oh,
to be honest, because that's something that everything feels wrong about managing permissions in an Excel sheet for me.
Totally. How comfortable am I? Because it is all in source control, because it is all audited, who made the change and when it run, I am actually quite happy with it.
Yeah.
When they made we had to teach these users how to use source control, but that was okay. They could then commit with a reference to the ticket. So actually, it made life much easier because the auditors could come in and say, why did this person have permission? And you can say, right, here we go. It was added in with this run of Azure DevOps that was for this commit that was done by this person from this ticket. And you go to look at the ticket and the ticket would show who authorized it and whatever.
Okay, so you didn't merely establish building permissions, granting permissions via Excel, but you established a whole process around it.
Exactly.
Then that's fine. Then my pain lessens a bit.
Yeah. And the other part of it is that it took work away from the DBAs that was manual and automated it. Yeah. So we were confident that across hundreds of instances, these were all applied correctly.
Okay, because that's something. Usually, when I hear stuff like that, it makes me cringe a little bit. I do get these kinds of requests, but usually my experience is that customers then shy away from having the process.
Yeah.
Like we want the automation, but not the process behind it. And then you end up with something that's totally uncontrollable.
This was a discussion that we started. They wanted this because the Excel sheet was how they gave permissions as requests to the DBAs. So that's where they started that from. So that team were comfortable with filling in request forms, and it just became a different type of request form that was in Excel for them. So
did you think about, I mean, you could take this one step further if you didn't want to teach DevOps. You could do stuff like place it in a SharePoint somewhere, and then from there trigger a logic app or something that then does the commit.
Of course, there are
discuss
many
stuff
ways.
Like that.
Yeah, there are many ways of making this work.
Doesn't make it feel more comfortable.
No,
the contrary.
No. And really, the second part of this, the technical part with Azure, is the bit that you would need to go through every time.
Yeah, totally.
So this was my deployment. This is normally what we would have run. If we look at our plan, you can see that let's look at our apply. That'll make more fun. You can see that it has, let's zoom you in a bit. It has gathered our information from our Key Vault, got our SQL Server admin, and then it's created the resource group, the SQL Server, the database, all of those things. Ben, what time do I finish?
You still have plenty of time. You have like 25 minutes left. So you're all set, all easy. I'll give you a 5 minute warning if you want to. But
yeah, that's okay. I thought it was 1:45. I was just checking.
Yeah.
So we did this and we created our let's find you there. There we go. So we created our resource group. Please go away. Thank you very much. We created our resource group, and in our resource group, we've got all of these things. Now, I show you this as well because I have some tags. So because I'm programmatically creating everything, I can put sarcastic things like this. And believe me, clients, I do literally put this sort of thing in. So it says, do not change this in the portal because these resources are controlled by Terraform. This is where the source control is. And if you make any changes, it says that you will break the CI/CD process or they'll be overwritten. Most of the time, it will break the CI/CD process, to be honest. It will make things break. But tags are fantastic. You definitely should be using them in all of your Azure resources. And if you're creating stuff programmatically, it gives you so much control over being able to ensure that this information is here for everybody. So if we can now unzoom, thank you. So we've got our SQL databases, we've got a SQL Server. These things are all as we would expect them to be. And yeah, this demo is now out of order because everything's built, but let's do it this way. Let's show you. So in my Azure Active Directory, I have a directory readers role, and what I have done then is assigned both my SQL instance and my SPN into this role. So that took maybe 4 or 5 minutes. It doesn't take very long to do. And that means that when I connect to my SQL instance, let's see what happens. Here we go. We've got our databases. Let's make you all go away and come back Azure. There we go. We've got our databases, and inside our databases, we have got some users. So bigger on Twitter, Catherine Wilhelmsen is in the Beard app one. We'll find out, see we find Ben. There's one Ben, but not the other Ben. Anyway.
Yeah.
We shall find you in a moment because this is kind of fun. So let's have a look in our directory. We'll find some users and we'll search for Ben. Here we go. So we have got this Ben, Berlin Ben Kettler.
Sounds about right.
We shall grab him. And we will add him into here. And this is now going to create our user. So we've got, we're going to check in our instance, does it exist? And if not, we're going to add to the role login manager. So we need to connect. We're going to connect to Beard SQL Elastic SQL Master as SQL admin. So this is a SQL authentication login. And when we run that command, it says we must declare the scalar variable role. Does it now? That's very interesting. Of all the things, that's better. That's what I was expecting. I was expecting this to fail, but I wanted it to fail for a different reason. Maybe I'd highlighted something here. So what we get when we try and add an Azure Active Directory user with a SQL authenticated account is this user cannot be created. Only connections established with Active Directory accounts can create other Active Directory users. Great. So if we change our connection and we will connect.
So as advertised.
Yeah, as advertised. We'll connect as me. So I'm going to be a user. And now I can run this. And there we go. So Ben has been added to the master database. And in fact, if we dive into here, we will see him if we refresh. There he is. Added as a login administrator by somebody. Well, that's not quite what we want to be able to do, is it? And actually, the problem is the junior DBA that's run this, that'll be me, has made a fatal mistake. Because what they meant to do was actually add Ben to one of the databases. So let's open up our Excel sheet. And let's even open it up on the same screen as you're sharing, Rob. That would be much better. Here we go. So we've got our Excel, and what we do is we control access by setting our tables here, and then we validate in this. If we go to data validation, you can see that we are, highlight the right one. Let's do that again. You can see that you've picked the wrong thing to validate, Rob. Gee whiz. You can see that what we're doing is we are allowing our validation from a list, and that is coming from instance names. And instance names, cancel, thank you, is from here. We'll do the same with databases. We do the same with roles. And then once you've added a login, then you can do the same with login. So you can see that Ben already exists as a user. And this time we're going to add him in to a database. So we'll pick our instance. We'll pick it on both of these lines. Pick your database, Ben.
I think the Beard app 2 is what I was looking for.
Beard app 2 is the one that you needed. Excellent.
Yeah.
So now we've got a drop down here, and we can find Ben. And of course, this doesn't come out in alphabetical order, but that's okay. It is a bit of a pain, but it's solvable if need be. And what permissions did you require? You've got two roles, I understand.
Yeah, I'm usually data writer, of course.
Okay.
And data reader.
Data writer and indeed data reader. Yeah. So let's just make sure that we put data reader in. Yes, I know I've made a mistake, and we'll save. We'll save this. We'll close our Excel sheet, and then we'll go to. We will go to here. Nope, we won't, because that's the wrong one. That's the one where you were fixing things from. we will go to here. And I'll do a clear screen. And what we will see is that elastic pool permissions, Terraform, elastic pool, refresh. Oh, I told you things were going to go fun. Ah, yes. That's because you're on the wrong one. Here we go. Your branch is up to date. Is it really? Why is your branch up to date? Well, what fatal mistake have you just made? So we have our elastic pool permissions. We're in the right repository. Oh, my life is so good right now. Let's try adding the folder again. Oh, yeah. Azure repos, Terraform. It is our elastic pool. We're going to add that into here. And now you are going to, that's presentations. You're going to insist that the only thing. Oh, see, temp elastic pools. That'd do it. If you add the wrong.
So you mean adding the right directories helps?
Oh, well, you know. GitHub, Azure repos. No, that's definitely not in ctemp. Why do you think you're in ctemp? In which case, I know what we can do. I know how we can fix this. We can fix this by copying that. Yep, so you're not going to work. And we can remove that, add in, if it's determined to be ctemp elastic pool, we shall do that. There we go. And we will paste you in here. And we will delete you. And oh my word, I'm so sorry. This is all me, not you.
Oh, it's fine.
Here we go. Right, so now we've got we've got an Excel sheet. So what's happened is I had a hard drive break, and I copied everything back from the backup into this D drive, new G drive. And for some reason, Git has decided to be funny. And I thought I'd fixed that earlier, but obviously I had not. So Ben needs these permissions, incident 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we will add in that. We will commit our message. Our users were doing this just in the command line. In fact, they were basically just running a script because we made life, oh, just don't do that. Elastic pool, git pull. Okay, you would like to such that we will just discard those changes then. And then we'll do a git pull. And now we can do a git push. So what's happened is we have changed our Excel sheet, and we've added in Ben's permissions, and we've put a commit message in, and then we've pushed our changes. And as we do that, look at that, without doing anything hands-off completely, we've got our permissions script running, and that is going to run and do all of the things that it needs to do. So it's going to add the firewall rule, etc. So whilst it's running, I am going to just check dbatools 2, you said, didn't you?
Yeah.
dbatools 2, I don't see you there. So that's good, because you could have picked one that you were already in.
Yeah.
I didn't think that through.
That's always the risk with like pick a card.
Yeah. So we've got
tricks.
adding our firewall rule, and you can see that all it does is add in a new firewall rule. It doesn't even. I used to put out the IP address, but I don't anymore. So if we come back and have a look at our, so look at the key vault, why not? When we look at our networking, you can see that we have added in our hosted agent IP address for the minute. And if we come back to here, there we go. Right, so now our key vault, that's there, and now our permissions are being added.
Maybe another question or comment.
Of course.
Since Excel is a binary file format,
yep,
you won't be able to do anything like diff.
You won't be able to do anything like diff, but when you need to do a diff, what you can do is dive into your repository, and then you can look at the history.
Yeah.
And whilst you can't go and compare,
yeah,
what you can do is download the two files, so we can go back.
Yeah, sure.
You know,
but you'll also always have to apply and check all of the roles in the Excel file.
Say that again.
You'll have to process the entire Excel file
every time,
because you don't have a delta. You cannot say, okay, I only add 2 rows, so there's only 2 rows that have changed, so there's only 2 rows that I need to process. You'll always have to process the full thing.
But what you're also doing is you're validating that
of course,
that the users are correctly applied as well.
Of course.
So
but if it weren't a binary format, then you could choose the diff and say, okay, this time the only thing that changed was Ben was added. And then you could have something like a nightly run automated that checks the permissions every night and goes over the full file.
Absolutely. And it's whichever way works. I mean, I would rather have them in a YAML file, in a JSON file or something, because it's much easier for me. But there again,
not for the users. Yeah,
we are not the ones that are in control of that.
Totally agree. I totally understand the rationale behind that.
So yeah, you're right. It's just enabling all of those automations. So
what's just a comment to say, okay, if your users were able to use any non-binary format, then you would have been able to do stuff like incremental updates.
Yep.
And could have saved yourself all those checks for each commit.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely is right. Now, hopefully, the next one that gets done, those are the master ones. So let's come back up here. What I wish you could do is actually search this whilst it was running, but you're not allowed to. Here we go.
Yeah.
We look here, we can see that we're creating, oh, that's a good one. Let's try that instead. We're creating Ben in the database dbatools on this instance, and then we're going to add him to the DBA writer role, and then we're going to add him to the, oh no, I made a mistake. Ben, I've denied you, reader. Oh, what a fool I am.
You don't want me to know too much.
Ah, that's what it is. So when we make a mistake, all we need to do is go to the right place where our file is, And we can open up our thing and oh, look at that. We can then save this and we can close it whilst that is still running. Here we go. So you see we're doing all of our validation. And now we can make sure we're in the right place here. So this time we'll do it command line. So we'll do git status and we will turn off you and we will do git status. Thank you very much. So we've modified our permissions. So I can do git add, hit the tab button, and then it'll automatically populate, add my Excel sheet. I'm going to go git commit -m Ben needs reader not deny reader exclamation mark. There we go. I can commit that, and now I can just do a git push, and that'll start pushing back up. So this one has finished. So if we look into our instance, you see we did not have Ben, and now there he is. There is our Ben added into our Beard app 2 user. And that's how simple it is to do. But if we go back and look, what we should also see is, oh no, look, it is sad. Ben is a user in master. This is not good. Yeah, and will now be dropped. There we go. So not
I don't want to make the beard sad.
Exactly.
Never.
Funny story, I did actually automate some stuff at a client that was just for the DBA team, and all of my error messages and warnings in the PowerShell was the beard is sad, whatever, the beard is sad, whatever. And what I didn't realize was about 6 months later, they gave this to another team to use. And we literally had a developer from that team walk in and go, the beard is sad. How can I make the beard happy?
You can try. We'll see if you succeed. Bring beer.
They put it into Octopus Deploy, and it was going all kinds of fun.
Yeah.
So
cool.
our other changes is flying through, and this time hopefully we're going to see that Ben gets added to the correct rule. But you'll notice that I didn't have to worry about the deny data reader. It should take care of that as well. So I'm sorry it's been a slightly chaotic demo, but if there are more questions, please feel free. Otherwise, we can go and look at the code if you would like to do that and see how it works.
You have 5 minutes left. Amazing. Since there are no questions in the chat and nobody's unmuted and ready to shout at you and say, stop, repeat, I don't understand. Okay. Let's go through the code.
Let's go and have a look at the code, and then we'll come back and see what's happened to these permissions in a while. So let's start with, where is it? So if you go to beard.media, let's do this in a browser because it will make much more sense. So if you go to beard.media/presentations, that's going to take you to my GitHub repository. We're in 2021. You're at the Global Azure Bootcamp. Here is all the information about it. Yes, here is all the information. So here's my PowerPoint. I'll put the rest of the code up in here as well in a few minutes. And what I will put in is this code. So we've got our Terraform. So how did we build our instance? We built our instance using this main file, and we defined some backend. We define some variables for how our things we wish to look at. And then this is how Terraform creates things. Go and have a look and see if there's a resource group called resource group name. And if there isn't, make it. And make sure it's in this location and it has these tags. This is how we make our SQL Server. So you can see we pick our version, name and the location of a resource group, pick our admin. We've pulled our login password from Key Vault. This is where we've added our Azure AD administrator, and this is where we've added our identity. And there are a lot of other things in here, creating databases, creating alerting policies, and our log analytics. The variables file is where we set what values we wish to have. And you can see here we've got our database names, we've got our capacity. So if we wanted to change the size or the SKU or anything, this is where we would make that change. And where is my AD object? Oh, that's because, no. I pre-fill my, I fill these values in from my deployment pipeline.
Yeah.
And that builds our environment. Our permissions is done with our deploy permissions code. We need to have dbatools and we need to have import Excel. This is some fluff for Azure DevOps to stop it showing me some warnings, which actually is what broke my thing. We then go and grab our Excel file from the repository, and then we get some values. We get our key vault, values out of our key vault. We then read the Excel file into PowerShell.
Sorry, Rob, quick question. Is that always installed also on the Azure hosted agents, or do you need to install an extension for that? For import Excel?
So that's what this does at the top.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
I missed that bit somehow.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so we have to install our modules that we require.
Okay.
And then just like I've been talking about, we then connect DBA instance to the login instance that we've pulled out of Excel, create an Azure SQL, we run the T-SQL query, and we invoke it, and then disconnect. It's exactly the same with our database users and their role memberships. And then we validate them. That's kind of the opposite way around. We just do a compare between the Excel values and what we find and take action as we need, and write everything out to script.
Perfect.
So that's all there. Let's have a look at our pipeline. Let's have a look at our pipeline, look at our deploy permissions. Now we can actually search because it has finished. Look for Ben. There we go. So Ben exists, existed in all of the roles, but not the DBA data reader role. So that was added. And then we come down a little bit more. And then we should see.
I think you scroll past it.
Have I scrolled past it? Yeah, no, that's the that's you checking that you're in the database. But what we need to do is check the rules. There are the rules. So because you were in the deny data reader role in the database, the system's gone, that's not in the Excel sheet. We will just send it away. So there we go. That is how it works for this client, but also some of the complications with the directory reader and the Azure Active Directory things that you need to work out just to be able to make this sort of permissions as code. I like that as a title.
Very cool. Thank you, Rob.
You're more than welcome. And as I said, any questions, that's how to get in touch with me.
Yeah, and somehow it seems to me, and seeing that also confirmed this whole DevOps stuff, once you have it running, it's really neat and it saves you a lot of time. But to get it up and running can really be a pain and costs a lot of time.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of time to get going. I think the more tricky thing is whenever you're dealing with anything to do with Azure, is that you can set something that just works. Yeah. So I've done this demo before, like 3 or 4 times before. And like I said, normally I start by going, right, I've got nothing. Let's build it with Terraform. Press the button and away we go. The problem is that Azure changes. So unless you can pin all of these things to a certain version, everything's going to move forward. And it's going to break, sometimes going to break what you're doing.
Your DevOps pipeline is not fire and forget, it needs maintenance.
All technology, I think. So if you watch Ben Weissman or Anthony Santino talking about Kubernetes, big data clusters, Azure Arc data enabled services, then they're always talking about pinning the version of Kubernetes that you're using, or the AZ CLI or the kubectl, to make sure that everything always works as you expect it and be in control of upgrading it. So I think actually it's just the new world that we're in. It's something we need to handle.
And I love it that way. Yeah. That's just the way it is, and you can either embrace it and try to find good solutions, or you can complain about it, but that won't change a thing.
It's just work for us, and we can go forward.
Great presentation, Rob, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you from me as well.
Thank you.
So now I don't
see any questions left.
Yeah. That means we now have an hour lunch break. And then we'll meet back again.
At 1:45.
That's right.
Quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. Then